The stage lights dimmed at the Staples Center in Los Angeles, and 20,000 voices fell silent. It was March 2009, and Michael Jackson stood before the world once more, announcing his final concert series. His sequin jacket caught the spotlights, sending fragments of brilliance across the darkened arena. He smiled that famous smile, the one that had lit up screens for 4 decades. He raised his hand in a delicate wave, and the crowd erupted. They saw their king. They saw immortality wrapped in skin and bone. But they didn't see the truth hiding behind those eyes. Michael had perfected the art of concealment long before most people learned to tie their shoes. As a child in Gary, Indiana, he discovered that survival meant performance. When his father's temper flared, young Michael would dance harder, sing sweeter, smile wider. The beatings would stop if the show was good enough. That lesson carved itself into his soul like words etched in stone. Show them magic, hide the pain. Give them wonder, bury the exhaustion. Be everything they need, nothing you are. Now, at 50 years old, he stood in that arena carrying the weight of half a century of pretending. His body ached in ways that went beyond physical pain. His knees throbbed from decades of impossible dance moves. His back screamed from old injuries never properly healed. His chest felt tight, his breathing shallow. Sleep had become a distant memory, something other people did. He survived on fragments of rest stolen between obligations, between demands, between the endless needs of everyone around him. The announcement that night was supposed to be simple. 10 concerts in London. A farewell to his fans. A gentle closing of a remarkable chapter. But the machine surrounding him had other plans. Promoters wanted 50 shows. Financial advisors insisted on it. Lawyers nodded in agreement. Everyone needed Michael to be Michael one more time, to print money with his mere presence, to save empires built on his name. Nobody asked if he could actually do it. Nobody wondered if the man inside the legend had anything left to give. As he left the stage that night, Michael whispered something to his longtime friend and choreographer. The words were so quiet they almost dissolved in the air between them. 3 simple words that carried the weight of a lifetime. 3 words that should have stopped everything. 3 words that changed nothing. He said, "I'm so tired." His friend patted his shoulder, mistaking exhaustion for stage nerves, confusing a cry for help with casual conversation. The moment passed. The wheels kept turning. The machine rolled forward, indifferent to the man crushed beneath its gears. Behind closed doors, away from cameras and crowds, Michael collapsed into silence. He sat in darkened rooms, staring at nothing, his mind a hurricane of worry. How would he possibly perform 50 shows when he could barely sleep through a single night? How would he dance when his body felt like shattered glass held together by willpower alone? The rehearsals loomed ahead like mountains he lacked the strength to climb. But saying no wasn't an option. It had never been an option. From the moment he could walk, Michael Jackson existed to perform, to please, to be consumed by a world that loved him and destroyed him in equal measure. His children noticed changes he tried to hide. Prince, Paris, and Blanket saw their father moving slower, smiling less. They heard him pacing at night, heard the quiet conversations about medications and sleep aids. They sensed something wrong in the way adults sense approaching storms. But they were children, powerless against the forces controlling their father's life. They could only watch as the man who meant everything to them slowly disappeared behind a mask of professional obligation and public expectation, becoming more ghost than father with each passing day. Rehearsals began in April at a converted soundstage in Los Angeles. The space buzzed with energy and ambition. Set designers built elaborate stages that defied physics. Choreographers mapped out routines that required superhuman stamina. Musicians tuned instruments for performances that needed to be flawless. Everyone involved understood they were creating something historic, something that would define careers and fill bank accounts for years to come. Everyone except Michael seemed thrilled by the prospect. He arrived late most days, moving through the rehearsal space like a man underwater. The dancers, young and hungry and grateful for the opportunity, watched him with concerned master's admiration. They'd grown up idolizing this figure, studying his every move, dreaming of the moment they might share a stage with him. Now they saw something that didn't match the legend. They saw a thin man who struggled to remember choreography he'd once performed without thinking. They saw someone who needed multiple takes for moves that used to flow like water. They saw exhaustion so profound it seemed to emanate from him like heat from pavement. Director Kenny Ortega tried to maintain optimism, but even his enthusiasm couldn't ignore reality. Michael would stop mid-rehearsal, hands on his knees, breathing hard. He'd forget lyrics to songs he'd sung 10,000 times. He'd lose his place in routines, staring blankly as dancers waited for his lead. During breaks, he'd disappear to his trailer, staying gone for hours while production assistants knocked gently, then urgently, then desperately. When he finally emerged, he'd apologize profusely, promise to do better, then deliver a performance so brilliant it made everyone forget their concerns. The cycle repeated endlessly, hope and worry trading places by the hour. His personal physician, Conrad Murray, became a constant presence. The doctor followed Michael everywhere, carrying a medical bag that seemed to hold solutions for every ailment. Fatigue? There was something for that. Anxiety? Another prescription. Insomnia? A cocktail of medications that would knock out an elephant. Murray presented himself as a savior, the only person who truly understood what Michael needed. The truth was far darker. The doctor was enabling a descent that everyone could see but nobody stopped. Michael talked about sleep the way drowning people talk about air. He was obsessed with it, desperate for it, destroyed by the lack of it. His mind raced constantly, filled with fears and doubts and memories he couldn't escape. Childhood trauma surfaced in quiet moments. The accusations and trials that had nearly destroyed him played on repeat. Financial pressures mounted daily, each phone call bringing news of another debt, another obligation, another person depending on him. Sleep required peace, and peace was something Michael Jackson hadn't known since he was 5 years old. The people around him noticed but rationalized. They told themselves he was just adjusting, finding his rhythm, getting back into performance shape. They remembered other tours when he'd seemed fragile at first but grew stronger as shows progressed. They convinced themselves this was normal, that legends operate differently than ordinary humans. They needed to believe it because their livelihoods depended on those 50 shows happening. Mortgages required Michael to be fine. Car payments needed him to be strong. Careers demanded he be immortal. Some tried to help in small ways. Dancers offered to simplify choreography. Musicians suggested cutting songs from the setlist. Stage managers proposed postponing the opening date. Michael refused every accommodation. His pride wouldn't allow it. The world expected Michael Jackson to be perfect, and he'd spent his entire life meeting that expectation. Admitting weakness felt like admitting failure, like confirming what critics had whispered for years, that he was finished, washed up, unable to compete with younger artists. So he pushed harder, slept less, took more pills, and pretended everything was under control even as control slipped through his fingers like sand. His assistant found him one afternoon slumped in a chair, tears streaming down his face. Michael looked up with eyes that held oceans of sorrow and whispered those words again, "I'm tired. I'm so tired." The assistant hugged him, promised things would get better, then returned to coordinating schedules and confirming appointments. The moment of vulnerability closed like a door, locked and forgotten. The machine needed feeding, and Michael was the fuel. By June, the illusion of normalcy had cracked beyond repair. Michael arrived at rehearsals wearing multiple layers despite the California heat, shivering as though winter lived inside his bones. His weight had dropped to alarming levels, his clothes hanging on a frame that seemed to shrink daily. Makeup artists worked overtime to hide the dark circles carved beneath his eyes, to add color to cheeks that had gone gray. They transformed him into a convincing replica of health, a Michael Jackson impersonator playing Michael Jackson himself. The date for the first London show approached like a speeding train, and panic spread through the production team. They had weeks of work left and days to complete it. Michael's attendance became sporadic. He'd miss entire rehearsals, then show up at midnight ready to work. He'd nail a performance one day and forget how to do it the next. His speech grew slurred, his movements uncoordinated. People whispered in corners, comparing notes, sharing concerns. But when someone suggested canceling or postponing, they were reminded of the money already spent, the tickets already sold, the lawsuits that would follow if Michael Jackson failed to deliver. Kenny Ortega reached a breaking point after one particularly difficult rehearsal. Michael had barely moved, standing center stage like a mannequin while dancers performed around him. Afterward, Kenny pulled him aside and spoke with desperate honesty. He said Michael needed rest, needed doctors beyond Conrad Murray, needed to take care of himself before attempting these shows. He begged Michael to pause, to prioritize health over performance. Michael listened with vacant eyes, nodded slowly, and promised to do better. Then he went home to the mansion he rented in Holmby Hills, climbed into bed, and stared at the ceiling for another sleepless night. Conrad Murray had his own concerns, though they centered more on liability than genuine care. The medications he'd been administering were dangerous individually and potentially fatal in combination. Michael demanded more, always more, the only language his exhausted mind understood. Murray knew he should refuse, should walk away, should report the situation to someone with authority to intervene. Instead, he stayed. The job paid well, and Michael assured him everything was under control. Two men lying to each other, pretending the lies were truth. Phone calls were made to tour promoters, carefully worded expressions of concern that stopped short of actual alarm. The promoters dismissed them. They'd invested millions and weren't interested in hearing about problems without solutions. They sent their own people to observe rehearsals, and Michael summoned reserves of energy he didn't possess to convince them everything was fine. He danced, he sang, he smiled. He gave them a show good enough to ease their fears and seal his fate. His children knew something terrible was coming. Children possess instincts adults rationalize away, and Michael's kids sensed death circling their father like a shark. Paris, only 11 years old, began having nightmares. Prince, 12, grew quiet and watchful. Little Blanket clung to his father with unusual intensity. They asked questions Michael deflected with false cheerfulness. He told them about London, about the shows, about the house they'd rent and the adventures they'd have. He painted pictures of a future he must have known would never arrive. Friends who'd known Michael for decades tried to reach him, but the fortress of handlers surrounding him had grown impenetrable. Calls went unreturned. Visit requests were denied. The few who managed to see him came away shocked by his appearance and unable to do anything about it. Michael existed in a bubble constructed by people with financial stakes in his continued performance, isolated from anyone who might prioritize his survival over their profit. On June 23, 2 days before he died, Michael attended his final rehearsal. Footage from that night shows a man summoning ghosts of former greatness, occasionally touching brilliance before fading back into frailty. He performed Earth Song with unexpected power, his voice finding strength his body lacked. He smiled at his dancers, thanked his crew, and left the stage around midnight. People who were there remember thinking he seemed better, that maybe the corner had been turned, that perhaps everything would work out after all. June 24, 2009 dawned bright and warm in Los Angeles, an ordinary California day that would end in tragedy. Michael woke late in his rented mansion, if woke is the right word for someone who'd barely slept. He moved through his morning routine slowly, his mind clouded by medications that never quite delivered the rest they promised. His children bounced around him with the oblivious energy of youth, excited about small things, living in the moment as children do. He hugged them longer than usual, held them tighter, as if some part of him knew time was running out. Conrad Murray arrived at noon, carrying his black medical bag like always. He found Michael agitated and complaining of exhaustion so deep it felt like dying. They talked about the rehearsal scheduled for that evening, about the pressure building from all sides, about the impossibility of the situation. Michael begged for sleep, real sleep, the kind that erased consciousness completely. He tried everything else. Pills that didn't work. Techniques that failed. Meditation that his racing mind refused to allow. He needed something stronger, something guaranteed. Murray hesitated. The drug Michael wanted was propofol, a powerful anesthetic used in hospitals for surgery. It wasn't meant for sleep, wasn't designed for home use, wasn't something any responsible physician would administer outside a medical facility. It shut down consciousness completely, stopping the body's natural protective reflexes. People on propofol couldn't breathe on their own if something went wrong. They needed constant monitoring, emergency equipment nearby, the infrastructure of a hospital. Using it in a bedroom for insomnia was medical madness, and Murray knew it. But Michael insisted with the desperation of a man drowning. He said other doctors had given it to him before, that he'd used it on previous tours, that it was the only thing that worked. He promised he'd be fine, that nothing would go wrong, that he just needed a few hours of real rest. Murray looked at the man who'd hired him, who paid him handsomely, who needed him. He looked at his own financial situation, the child support he owed, the lifestyle he wanted to maintain. He made a choice that killed a man and destroyed his own life in the process. The afternoon crawled by in that mansion, ordinary hours ticking toward catastrophe. Michael's kids played in another part of the house, their laughter drifting through halls lined with rented furniture. Staff moved through their duties, preparing meals nobody would eat, organizing schedules that would become meaningless. Outside, Los Angeles went about its business, millions of people living normal lives while history prepared to shift. Around 10 that night, Michael went upstairs to his bedroom. Murray followed, carrying the propofol and other medications meant to help Michael sleep. They went through the ritual they'd established over previous nights, Murray setting up and 4, Michael settling into bed, both pretending this was safe and normal and fine. The medication dripped into Michael's veins, pulling him down into artificial unconsciousness. Murray stayed briefly, watching his patient drift away, then stepped out to make phone calls. This is where the story becomes disputed, where different accounts contradict each other, where truth gets buried under legal proceedings and conflicting testimonies. What's certain is this: Conrad Murray left Michael Jackson alone while under propofol, a violation of every medical standard. He made phone calls, sent text messages, disappeared from the room for periods too long to justify. Michael's body, deprived of proper monitoring, began to fail. His breathing became shallow, then stopped. His heart, lacking oxygen, began to stutter. Death crept in through the silence, taking a man nobody was watching closely enough to save. Murray returned to find Michael not breathing, his skin cold, his pulse absent. Panic exploded through the doctor's professional composure. He began chest compressions, poorly executed and too late. He called for help from staff who weren't trained for emergencies. He fumbled with his phone, trying to decide what to do, how to explain this, who to call. Precious minutes dissolved while he tried to control a situation that had already spiraled beyond redemption. The 911 call came at 12:21 p.m. on June 25. Murray claimed he just found Michael unresponsive, a lie that investigators would later unravel. The operator's voice on the recording sounds professional and calm, asking questions, giving instructions. In the background, chaos. People shouting. Movement and panic. And silence from Michael, who was already gone. Paramedics arrived at the Holmby Hills mansion to find a scene of confusion and desperation. They rushed upstairs to a bedroom where Conrad Murray was still performing CPR on a body that had gone cold. One look told them what Murray refused to accept. Michael Jackson was dead, had been dead for a while, was beyond any help they could provide. But they went through the motions anyway, loading him onto a stretcher, starting medications that couldn't restart a heart too damaged to respond. They transported him to UCLA Medical Center knowing they were carrying a corpse, maintaining the fiction of emergency treatment because Michael Jackson couldn't simply be dead in a bedroom. The hospital staff tried everything medicine knows to revive a human being. They shocked his heart, pumped his chest, flooded his system with drugs meant to jumpstart life. Nothing worked. Nothing could work. At 2:26 p.m. Pacific Time, a doctor pronounced what everyone already knew: Michael Joseph Jackson, 50 years old, was dead. The news rippled through the hospital, then exploded into the world beyond. Within minutes, social media erupted. Twitter crashed from the volume of posts. News websites buckled under traffic. Phone lines jammed as people called everyone they knew to share the impossible information. Michael Jackson was dead. The king of pop was gone. The voice that had defined generations had fallen silent. People who'd grown up with his music felt the news like a physical blow. Strangers wept openly. Radio stations abandoned regular programming to play his songs. The world convulsed in collective grief. But in the hours before official confirmation, a darker story unfolded at that mansion. Conrad Murray and other members of Michael's inner circle scrambled to control the narrative and cover their tracks. They removed medications, cleaned the bedroom, made phone calls to lawyers instead of family. They worried about lawsuits and prison sentences and public blame. 4 crucial hours, as the world waited for official word, the people who'd surrounded Michael in life protected themselves instead of his legacy. His 3 children learned their father was dead not from family but from chaos and confusion. Staff members crying, security guards rushing around, strangers flooding their home. Paris, Prince, and Blanket suddenly became the most famous orphans in the world, their mother Debbie Rowe estranged, their care uncertain, their futures terrifying. They'd lost the one person who loved them unconditionally, the father who'd shielded them from public scrutiny, the man who'd been their entire world. The investigation that followed revealed everything people had ignored while Michael lived. The dangerous medications. The reckless doctor. The financial pressures. The warning signs nobody heeded. Conrad Murray eventually went to trial for involuntary manslaughter, convicted and imprisoned for 4 years. But the real guilt spread far wider than one doctor. It included everyone who demanded more from Michael than he could give, who'd valued his performance over his life, who'd heard him whisper "I'm tired" and kept the machine running. In death, Michael became what he'd always been in life, a commodity to be sold, analyzed, debated, and consumed. Documentaries dissected his final days. Books revealed secrets he tried to hide. Investigators pored over every detail of his death while largely ignoring the lifetime of exhaustion that preceded it. The world mourned the loss of his talent while learning nothing about the system that destroyed him. His memorial service at the Staples Center drew thousands. Stevie Wonder sang. Mariah Carey performed. His daughter Paris spoke through tears, telling the world her father was the best dad anyone could have. 20 million people watched online. The coverage was beautiful and meaningless, a celebration of a life nobody had protected, grief for a man everyone had used. Years later, the This Is It footage from those final rehearsals was released as a documentary. People watched Michael dance and sing, looking for signs of the tragedy to come. They saw moments of brilliance and hints of struggle. They debated whether he could have actually performed those 50 shows, whether the concerts should have been cancelled, whether someone should have saved him. The answers don't matter anymore. Michael Jackson whispered that he was tired, and nobody stopped to listen. He spent his entire life giving pieces of himself to a world that demanded everything and gave back nothing. He died in a rented bedroom, alone despite being surrounded by people, another casualty of fame's grinding machine. His children grew up without him, shaped by loss and public scrutiny. His music continues to play, generating profits for people who never knew him. His legacy remains complicated: genius and victim, legend and cautionary tale, a man who never got to just be human because the world needed him to be extraordinary. Michael Jackson whispered that he was tired, and we should have listened. We should have stopped. We should have let him rest. Instead, we took everything he had to give and then mourned when nothing remained. That's the real tragedy, not that he died, but that we killed him slowly, publicly, and with his cooperation, consuming him until only the music survived.